Pcie Sonic, the heart of your system.
Hello, Briony here from Kit Guru, and in this video I'm taking a look at a case from Deepcool. It's the MATREXX 70 and it has a recommended retail price of around £65 here in the UK. MATREXX 70 also comes in at $70 if you're in the US as well. So this PC case is a midi size tower case. I've got it here beside me just so we can take a little look at it while it's empty. And in the second half of the video I'll talk about once I've built it and things, but it's just a lot easier to take a look at the case before it's got any components in it. Being a mid-tower size case, that means it's got plenty of space for all the components you would want, like a full-size motherboard and plenty of cooling and things, but it's also going to not take up as much space on your desk as sort of a full-size tower PC case. So overall this case is pretty plain really. It is a big black square of a case. It doesn't look very different to a lot of cases that are already on the market. It doesn't particularly stand out. It's got a very plain front, very plain side panels, very plain roof, etc. Some people are going to see this as boring. Other people are probably going to dig the minimalistic design and see it as more sort of a blank canvas. The only real interest that sort of comes with this case is that it does have a couple of tempered glass side panels. So the front and side of the case is tempered glass, and also it does come with a tempered glass Pcie shroud as well. With this case, it also doesn't seem to come with any form of RGB, so there's no RGB fans included with this case. You will have to add the RGB lighting later on when you put components in the build. The Pcie shroud even has sort of like a transparent strip where you can place an LED strip behind it, but this unfortunately isn't included with the case. There are other cases at this price point that do come with RGB lighting, so I'm a little bit disappointed that Deepcool didn't opt to include it in this case. Although if you're someone that isn't a fan of RGB lighting, it means you aren't paying for something that you're not going to want or use. Taking a look at the front I/O that comes with this case, you get two USB 3 ports. You also get a USB 2 port. There is a jack for the microphone, a jack for a headphone. There's also a power and a reset button, so it's all pretty standard up there. There is also a little bit of subtle Deepcool branding as well, which obviously lets you know that it's a Deepcool case, but I think it's quite understated and you don't particularly notice it. The tempered glass side panel in this case can be removed pretty easily using just the two thumb screws. It also pops out on this sort of hinge system, so when you undo those screws it doesn't sort of immediately fall onto the desk. I do quite like this as tempered glass is obviously quite fragile and you certainly don't want to be dropping it. The front of the case tempered glass side panel is even easier to remove, as instead of having thumb screws like you typically find on a case, it does actually have a little button. So by pushing that button, the tempered glass side panel simply pops off on a hinge, so it doesn't immediately drop down and is very, very simple and easy to remove. I do think it is a nifty little idea that seems to work quite well. Taking a look on the inside of this case, the main feature that you're going to find is the tempered glass Pcie shroud. It's something that I've never seen on a case before. I'm not actually sure if there is another case that has this yet. To me it is slightly pointless. It is only an aesthetic thing, but I do think it will look rather good with some sort of lighting shining out from underneath, particularly if you're someone that wants to invest in an RGB power supply. The Pcie shroud sort of tempered glass part is sat on like a plastic bit, so this part along the bottom here is made of plastic. It then has the transparent strip that I mentioned earlier, and the tempered glass is the top section, which is attached using a single thumb screw. It does sit reasonably well on top of the plastic, but I mean it isn't perfect. This is more of a cheaper case, so it does have a little bit of movement to it. When it comes to motherboard support, this case can take up to an E-ATX motherboard. I must say though that it probably is going to overlap some of the cable management holes. Fortunately, you do have some more further slots further along the motherboard tray, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. The motherboard standoffs also come pre-installed, which I do definitely like, as of course it saves quite a little bit of time when it comes to building. You don't have to sort of screw in those fiddly little things. Also behind the motherboard you have 7 PCIe Pcie slots, and they are also the nice sort of screw off ones as opposed to being those cheaper nasty snap off ones. To the right of the motherboard you will see there is space to mount 2 SSDs around the front of this case. I do quite like that. I think it can look quite smart, and I think I'm definitely going to try it when it comes to building this case, as the holes for the cable management seem to be pretty well positioned. One thing I must say I don't like about the inside of this case though is that if we look towards the roof of the case, you can just see all sort of the front panel I/O exposed up there. I am being a little bit picky as this is slightly more of a budget case, but I think it is something that could be easily fixed with just a little bit of metal, a little bit of plastic or something, and it does really sort of ruin the overall look of the case, as it is sort of on the side where you're definitely going to see it if you are looking inside the tempered glass panel. When it comes to cooling in this case does only come with the one plain black fan in the back of the case. I must say I'm slightly disappointed that a £65 case does only come with the one fan. I'm used to more budget cases now even sporting RGB fans that come with the case that are more usable. This fan seems pretty basic and pretty cheap, and it also comes with a daisy chained MOLLEX connector, which I'm really not a fan of. You can of course also have the option to plug it into your motherboard, but that MOLLEX connector is always going to be sitting there and it is really not going to look that nice, and in general the fan probably isn't going to be that usable if you want a case that looks really lovely and really pretty and RGB. Other cooling options, if we take a look towards the top of the case, you can fit up to 3 120 or 140mm fans. There's also space for a 360mm radiator as well, and I can imagine there is going to be a decent amount of clearance between the top of the motherboard and the radiator also. The front of the case can take up to 3 120 or 140mm fans, and it also can take a 360mm radiator. There seems to be a decent amount of clearance between where you mount the radiator and the PSG shroud, so that will be good. Maybe you could even fit a push-pull configuration in there if you're using some of those sort of slimmer fans. Also, with the front of this case, installing a all-in-one cooler is made a little bit easier in the fact that the sort of radiator holder or fan holder can be taken out the front of the case using 6 screws, and then you can attach it outside the case instead of sort of struggling to get it in place where you can't see it properly or reach it very easily. I must say the front of this case does actually look pretty impaired when it comes to airflow as well. We are seeing it on a lot of cases now that they have this sort of tempered glass front panel. We all know that it affects airflow over having a mesh panel. It does of course look very aesthetically appealing, but it's certainly something to bear in mind. It does have these vents that run down the side here, but it's obviously going to not have the same airflow as a more performance case. So in general, I do think this case has more of an emphasis on aesthetics over having the best performance. One thing I look out for also when I'm talking about the cooling on the case is that all of the vents to fit fans are dust filtered as well, because of course it does help with maintenance, and getting dust out of your case, keeping dust out of your case does prolong the life of your components. So along the bottom of this case it has a really nice filter actually. It runs all along the bottom, so across the PSG shroud, down through the entire sort of bottom of the case. You're not going to have any dust coming up from the floor if you do opt to put your PC on the floor if you haven't got enough desk space, or just in general just sitting around, dust getting stuck underneath it and things. This is a really nice dust filter, and it does come out nice and easily as well. On the top of the case it has a dust filter that is a little bit more basic. It's just a thin piece of mesh, but it's held on with a few magnets, so it seems to hold in place pretty well, and of course it is very easy to remove and clean as well. The dust filter in the front of the case is certainly the poorest of the three. It is attached in with a few sort of little slots really. It's slightly awkward to remove, it's still actually taped on. Oh, there we go. It's attached on with a few sort of little slots, and it is very flimsy. There's nothing really to it at all. It would have been much nicer if sort of attached on with some magnets or something. And also to me the positioning of the dust filter is very odd. It's on sort of this side of the case, so if you were to fit fans it's going to sit really weird on top of the screws, and if you're going to be using an all-in-one cooler with a radiator you're not going to be able to use the dust filter at all because it isn't going to have anywhere to sit basically. I've now flipped the MATREXX 70 around so we can take a little look at what's going on behind the scenes. So the back panel has the same sort of removal system as the front panel. It's 2 thumb screws at the top of the case, and then it also comes off with a little hinge. If we take a look around the back here, you can see that it does have the bundle of front I/O cables. So they are coated in a black plastic. That does certainly help to make the finished build look a little bit nicer. Of course, I'm not a fan of how they sort of come in from the top of the case, as it is quite visible, but the cables themselves seem to be of a decent quality, and it will help to make the build look a little better once it's finished. There seems to be a good amount of slots for threading cables through round to the front of the where the motherboard is going to be, and get all those cables through and route them nicely. Unfortunately though, it doesn't come with any rubber grommets, so I do like them mostly for aesthetic purposes, but also they can help to protect the cables as well. Fortunately, there isn't any real sharp edges or anything, but it is something that I would like to see on this case. The areas to sort of tie cable ties through or Velcro straps through seem to be pretty well positioned, and they are nice and wide as well, so you can maybe get several cable ties through there or Velcro straps like I mentioned. The depth for cable management also seems to be pretty good as well. So you do get up to 30mm. That is reasonably generous for a mid-tower size chassis, so you shouldn't have to sort of force the back panel back on once the cables are tied down. Hard drive support comes in the form of these 2 hard drive bays here. They do seem to be of pretty decent quality. They aren't plastic, they are actually made of cold rolled steel like the rest of the case, and they can be easily removed using just a thumb screw for each. They don't seem to come with any sort of quick mounting system though, so you will have to sort of screw the hard drive in old school style. Round the back here, there is also a further 2 slots to install SSDs. So you can install 2 SSDs in the front of the case and also 2 around the back here. They are on little trays, so they come out with a single thumb screw. They sort of slide out quite easily. Then you can install your SSD and put it back into the case. So those are quite nifty in general. It does have pretty good drive support and also a decent amount of features for cable management as well. When it comes to the overall build quality of this case, I must say it's pretty decent. The entire chassis is made of cold rolled steel, and it is a really good thickness as well, so to me it feels very solid and sturdy. It's better than some cases I have tried at this price point. The motherboard tray is also very strong as well. It's often somewhere where you can tell that case manufacturers kind of cut back on the materials that they use, but even applying a decent amount of force to the motherboard tray, it doesn't have any real flex or movement to it. You will find a little bit of plastic on this case as well. The entire thing isn't made of steel. There's a little bit of plastic that runs down the side vent. The bottom of the case is also made of plastic, so sort of the feet and things, and also the Pcie shroud part of it is made of plastic as well. But I don't think that it is an overly plastic case. The plastic areas do actually seem to blend in really well with the sort of steel chassis. The entire case in general does seem to be pretty well finished. There's no sort of horrible sharp or unfinished areas, and also the paint job is nice and smooth and it does look really well. There's no sort of chips or scratches in it and things. The only real improvements I think this case could have when it comes to build quality, I don't really like that front filter. I think it is a bit of an afterthought and it's not really designed very well to be easily accessible or usable. Also, I'm not a fan of this rear black fan. I think they probably could have included a better high quality fan, and also the Pcie shroud, the tempered glass bit does have a little bit of wobble to it as well, but in general it does feel like a very solid and has pretty decent build quality for a case at this price point. So that is the MATREXX 70 all empty. I'm now going to get some components installed in this case, so through the power of editing, let's fast forward in time and take a look at how I found building in this case. So I've now finally completed my build in the MATREXX 70 PC case. You can see that I've got it on the desk beside me here and it's all sort of lit up now and ready to go. Here is a full list of the components that I used in this build, and as you can see I installed a few more fans just to give this case a bit of a chance when it comes to airflow. So there's 3 RGB Deepcool fans in the front of the case. I've also installed a Deepcool RGB cooler which does sort of match the fans at the front, and then I also put in run a RGB LED strip along this sort of transparent panel that runs along the Pcie shroud, so you can get sort of the full effect once you've got components in this case. I opted to change all the fans and the lights and things inside the case to kind of this nice relaxing blue colour. They can of course all do loads of RGB effects and things using the software on the motherboard that I'm using. Plug them into RGB headers and then they all sort of control and match up and synchronise and things. You can do a load of different effects and that. The Deepcool did send me over the fans and the CPU cooler for sort of the purpose of the review, because of course they do match their own case. The reason I went for the blue colour is because the front I/O does actually light up blue, so the USB ports and the power button and reset button and things do actually light up this blue colour. So it's not strictly a plain black case, it does have a little bit of blue lighting on it, but to me it probably doesn't make too much difference if you are going to go for a different colour, because it is only just at the top of the case, but I do think it is definitely something worth mentioning. Also with the RGB lighting, even though I have removed this side panel here, the side panel is actually tinted slightly less than the front tempered glass panel. So this tempered glass panel is definitely a bit darker, so it means that you don't get completely blinded by those front fans. Whereas this side panel here is slightly less tinted, so you can still see sort of nicely inside the case where maybe you have a little bit of more subtle RGB lighting, and you can see into the tempered glass Pcie shroud. It does seem like I'm going on and on a little bit about the RGB lighting in this case, and I think it is because it does really enhance the overall aesthetic. This case without the components and lighting and things in is a pretty boring case, and it does seem that it is sort of made to showcase these sort of brightly coloured components. And I must say it does look really nice in the dark with that tempered glass Pcie shroud. It does create a really nice effect, and I must say I am much more of a fan of the overall aesthetics of this case now it does actually have components in it. However, one thing to remember about this case is of course it doesn't actually come with any of the RGB fans. Those 3 fans that Deepcool sent me, the ones at the front of the case, are £35 for the set. So the total price for the case with the same sort of effect as what you can see next to me, you're looking at like £100 in total. So that does make it less of a budget case. And of course as well, if you want to make the most of the tempered glass Pcie shroud, you're going to have to pay a bit extra for an RGB power supply or get a few LED strips and things just to make the most of the case. It's not sort of a budget case that is going to look its best without spending a little bit extra on some flashy lighty up RGB components and things. For me, when it came to building in this case, I found it to be pretty straightforward. It is a mid-tower size case, but there is plenty of space for manoeuvring the motherboard into place. There's plenty of space to get the power supply in. And I also found the 3 front fans really easy to install because it does also have that sort of removable bracket. So I could take it outside the case, screw the fans in, and then put it back into place without sort of having to fiddle around holding them up and working against gravity really. There was also some good cable management holes to thread the fans through, the cables of the fans through round to the back of the case, so I could cable manage them that a little bit more easily and keep them out of the way of the sort of more aesthetic front of the case. I found the SSD easy to install in the case. I did install it around the front like I mentioned I was going to do at the start of the video, and those slots to thread the SATA cables through were really well positioned. I just used a right angled SATA data connector, and then the SATA power connector went in pretty easily as well. I just had to ensure that I installed them before I screwed the SSD into place, as the clearance is a little bit tight, but they will definitely work, and I do think it does look quite nice installed around the front. The Pcie slots were very easy to remove. Of course they are the easy screw off ones, and the little screws were actually outside of this chassis. It's something that I have seen before. I do actually quite like it because it's much easier to sort of maneuver the screwdriver into place. You're not trying to sort of lean round this edge here, you have just got it outside the case, so it's definitely a little bit easier. As you can see, there is plenty of space for a nice big long GPU. I'm only using a little RX 580, but if you want a big triple fan card, you have got plenty of room, even if you're going to be installing an all-in-one in the front of the case. There is even a little sort of hole on the Pcie shroud where you can also install a GPU bracket that Deepcool cell to sort of support the larger GPUs. There's also a decent amount of clearance for a CPU cooler. I really wouldn't want to go too much taller than the one that I've got in the case already, but there is a decent amount. It's more than you do get in some cases. Plugging in all the cables to get the components connected up wasn't actually too bad either. There is quite a decent amount of room to maneuver in this place, and all the sort of holes to thread cables through are well positioned as well. So there's a couple of 8 pins for my AMD processor. They went into the top of the motherboard very easily. There is a good amount of clearance up the top there, so you're not struggling to squish your hand into tiny little spaces to get them plugged in. The 24 pin didn't quite line up, but it doesn't really matter, and it does look very, very neat. Also down the bottom here, the front I/O the hole for the front I/O cables to go through was very well positioned actually, particularly for this motherboard as well, because the front I/O is sort of over on the left hand side here. And they came up through the top very easily, and there's a nice generous amount of space and things. So they do have to sort of sit on top of the PSU shroud, but there is a really good hole to get them through, because I hate cases that don't have spaces to thread front I/O through and you have to trail them all the way across. So that was definitely a big bonus when it came to plugging in the cables. The only slight niggles I had when it comes to building in this case, and they are quite slight issues as well, it's not really a big problem, but it is something that I did find annoying, and I do like my case builds to go as smoothly as possible. That front dust filter I found to be extremely frustrating, because it's really awkward to get back into place. It has all the little kind of notches that you have to thread in, and then you put one in and the other one pops out, so I was struggling with that slightly. However, it does actually sit surprisingly flush to the screws. I thought once I had some fans installed the front of the case that it was going to kind of bulge out and look a bit weird. You still can't use it with an all-in-one cooler, but it is usable when you've got fans in the front of the case. And of course it means not having it around the front here, you do get a slightly nicer effect through the front glass panel. Also, the LED strip that runs along the bottom here, this PSU shroud, part of the PSU shroud is made of plastic, and if you're sort of aware of the newer style LED strips, a lot of them have like sticky plastic, but they also have little magnets in as well, which is a really smart idea, because it means that they oh, I put my finger in the fan. It means that they stick really well onto cases now, whereas with the plastic PSU shroud, it didn't really want to stick in place very well. I did manage to get it in there in the end, but it was a slight frustration I had. Maybe if Deepcool put a couple of like magnets in this, it would work much better for putting an LED strip in. But it is only a slight issue, and in general, building in this case I found to be pretty straightforward. I've now flipped the case around so we can take a little look at what's going on behind the scenes and all judge my cable management skills, because I know that's what people love doing. To be honest though, I think I did a pretty decent job. I'm pretty proud of it. I spent a bit of time, but it wasn't actually too much time, which to me is actually a sign of a good case. If you don't have to spend hours and hours trying to get all the cable ties into place just so you can put the side panel back on, it's always a good thing. So there was lots of places to tie the cables down. There's lots of nice places to thread cable ties through. Every time I sort of went to thread a cable tie, there was somewhere to put it, which was really nice. Also, the slots through to the front of the motherboard are well positioned. I did miss having rubber grommets, because I will admit you have to be a little bit careful where you route cables, because without the rubber grommets it is quite easy for them to be visible on the other side, because you have just got like these kind of open holes here, and obviously if you route a cable across one of those you're going to see it on the other side. But in general the clearance and things was really good, so I can imagine that maybe the back panel would probably bow out a little bit if you had like a big wad of cables, but as long as you tie the cables down enough, I had no problem getting the back panel back on. It went back on first time for me, and in general I do think it is a pretty easy case to cable manage, and I had no problems getting it all into place in a reasonable amount of time. So I've talked and talked and talked about the aesthetics of the case and what it's like to build in, etc. Now I'm going to actually move on to how well it performs. So like I said, I've installed 3 extra fans in the front of the case, so it's obviously going to make a little bit more noise than if it just had the default plain back fan in the back of the case, but who's just going to use the case with the one fan that it comes with? In general though, I did find it to be pretty quiet. So while idle it's 37.2 decibels, which you can hear if you put your head up to it, but it's certainly not a loud case. Also, when it comes to it under load, it got up to 42 decibels. So That means it's not a silent case. It obviously does make some fan noise, but it's actually quieter than quite a few cases that I've tested. It might just be that the fans that I've installed, the Deepcool fans, happen to be quite quiet fans, and that it just didn't create much fan noise, because it obviously doesn't have any noise dampening or anything. But I think maybe the lack of gaps, I guess, gaps where airflow and things, maybe also helps to keep the noise levels down. So it was actually quite a surprisingly quiet case, despite the lack of any sort of noise dampening material. So when it comes to the cooling performance in this case, I did my sort of usual test. So I took a reading while the case was idle, the PC was idle. So I kind of turned it on, left it there for half an hour, an hour, let all the components sort of get up to like their idle temperature, just leave it sitting to kind of warm up or whatever. The CPU got up to 38 and the GPU got up to 42. This is actually a little warmer than what I'm used to from seeing at idle temperatures. So when I saw those temperatures, I was like, this stress testing is going to be a little bit interesting. So I did a bit of gaming on the PC. I also did my 10-minute stress test with Ada64, and the maximum temperature I saw for the CPU was 63 and 79 degrees for the GPU. So those obviously aren't too hot. Those temperatures are actually pretty decent, like nothing is overheating, considering it is only like an air-cooled PC as well. However, I was very suspicious that that front panel was choking the components. The tempered glass panel at the front, there is quite restricted airflow in this case, so I did want to test that out. So I let the PC cool back down, I let it get back down to the idle temperatures, and I took the new idle temperatures with that front glass panel off, and then I also did the stress test again with the front glass panel off, and the CPU was actually a couple of degrees cooler while idle and while under load. The GPU stayed about the same temperature while it was idle, but it was actually 7 degrees cooler while it was under load with that front glass panel off. So obviously that is quite a large noticeable difference. I mean, I did this all on the same day, my ambient temperature was all the same and everything, and that is definitely a noticeable difference between having the glass panel on and the glass panel off. So what I can definitely say is that the front glass panel does choke the components. For me, the best thing I can think to do with this case is that the front glass panel actually comes off really easy because it has that button, and also it doesn't affect the dust filter either because it's installed in the back of the case. So what you could do is, if you're kind of doing anything strenuous with this case, is you could just take off the front glass panel and get much better airflow instantly just from taking it off. Obviously that's not ideal because it's much better if a case has good airflow by default, but if you really want a tempered glass panel to look all pretty and things, but also want to get the performance, I'd recommend just taking it off and you can get yourself a few extra degrees off the top of your CPU and GPU. So in general, performance isn't a problem in the case that components overheat, but it is a problem in the fact that it doesn't perform as well as a case that has a mesh front panel. So with this case, there is definitely more of an emphasis on aesthetics over general cooling performance. So overall, what do I think of the MATREXX 70 case from Deepcool? I must say overall, I think this case does have some rather good points. So it looks very, very nice now it's all lit up. There's no denying this is a really attractive case. Now it's got all of the RGB components in it and things. The build quality of the chassis is really good. It's a nice, strong, sturdy case for £65. You also get a good amount of tempered glass for your money, and also as well you do get plenty of cooling options, and also it's quite an easy case to build in as well. For me, I do really like the tempered glass PSG shroud when it comes to the case of aesthetics and things, but for me, I do think you really are paying for it in more of a budget case. It's a feature I'd like to see in a more expensive case, maybe £100 price point, £150 price point, because it means that you're not missing out in other areas. There's a few corners that have been cut in this case that I think could be improved that would overall make it like a much better case for me. So the lack of the rubber grommets, maybe the amount of plastic, the kind of front dust filter that I don't really like, the fact that the front I/O is visible at the top. It's a few niggly things, but at this price point, the £65 price point, it is a really competitive price point, and there is a lot of really good budget cases on the market. And for me, I think unless you've really fallen in love with the tempered glass PSG shroud, you love it, you think it's a really unique thing, you just have to have it, I think it's worth considering other cases on the market and maybe not going straight for the MATREXX 70. If you like this video from KitGuru, make sure to give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more from KitGuru, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Also, please remember to press the little bell icon as well, and you'll get a notification every time a new video goes live, so you'll make sure not to miss any. Other ways to help KitGuru out, we also have a Patreon account, so you can sign up there and get a few extra exclusives and things. You can join our Discord channel, and we also have some KitGuru merchandise as well. I'm sporting one of our lovely t-shirts. Make sure to check those out and you can get one of your own. Thanks for watching.